In the second-to-last apartment, Robert Samuel Johnson squeezed his P-47C's control stick. The Thunderbolt was flying at the back of his squadron at 28,000 feet. A few minutes ago, the 56th Fighter Group crossed the English Channel. 48 Republic P-47 Thunderbolts planes fly alongside. For B-17 bombers coming back from hitting the Villiers airfield near Paris. He had Johnson won his first game only a few weeks before. It was his 23rd birthday, and he was from Lorton, Oklahoma. Air combat over occupied Europe was a brutal business. The mechanic's son, Johnson grew up poor during the Great Depression. He got his pilot's license the day before he turned 16, taking on odd jobs to save every penny. He was now flying one of the biggest and heaviest, 7 tons of metal and fury powered by 18 cylindrical works of American engineering. The very large Pratt & Whitney R280 radial engine in front of him had 2,000 horsepower and could turn a 13-foot thruster that could speed the Thunderbolt through the air at more than 400 miles per hour. After that, everything went off. 16 fighter Faller Wolf FW-190S from Yagashwata 26. The best units of the Luftwaffe fell from 32,000 feet. The first pass, the lightning bolts were spread out. Johnson's plane, which was flying behind Charlie, took a lot of damage from several German fighters. 20mm cannon shells tore through his fuselage. The canopy broke. When hydraulic lines burst, fluid sprayed all over his face and looked into his eyes. His right leg was hit by pieces of a cannon shell. The tip of his nose was cut by a machine gun bullet. The engine caught fire. Johnson desperately tried to get out, but his canopy was stuck because it had been hit by a cannon. It would start up. He couldn't get his parachute through because it was only 6 inches wide. The fire put out itself because it didn't have any fuel. Fueled by the broken lines. But Johnson was only partly seeing because his eyes were swollen shut from hydraulic fluid burns, trying to fly an airplane that had been hit by at least 21 direct 20mm cannon shots and more than 207.92 mm machine gun hits. Any other fighter would have broken down. Most people in the planes would have died. Johnson kept his Thunderbolt in the air. Right now, would be one of thousands that changed the way German fighter pilots thought about American engineering in a fundamental way. Ideas about the German Luftwaffe had been trained on planes that put speed, maneuverability, and beautiful efficiency. Every single gram of weight was checked. Every choice in the design was made with performance in mind. From what I could tell, the Americans had built something very different. They made a tank that could fly, and that difference led to a big change in how fighters are made that would have an aviation for many years to come. The best German fighters, or aces, men who had shot down hundreds of Allied planes, were about to learn a lesson that would make them feel small. Skill. And even the most powerful weapons wouldn't help if your enemy wouldn't fall. The P-47 Thunderbolt story is about more than just a plane. It's about the clash of 2 engineering ideas, 2 ways of thinking about survival, and 2 ways of fighting itself. And it all starts with a simple, scary question that German pilots asked themselves every time they fought this huge American fighter. Why does it not go down? What the Republic P-47? In November 1942, the Thunderbolt was put into service with the U.S. Army Air Forces. At first glance, it looked like it went against every fighter design rule that had been set up in the first 3 years of the war. The most common model, the P-47D, weighed 17,500 pounds. lb at full takeoff weight, making it the heaviest single-engine fighter of all time. The fights. On the other hand, the Supermarine Spitfire weighed about 9,500 pounds. How the mess met. The Fuller Wolf FW-190A weighed 7,500 pounds, and the BF-109G weighed 7,500 pounds. 10,800 pounds. The P-47 weighed almost twice as much as Germany's biggest fighter plane. Fighter who did well. German intelligence officers looking at pictures and early encounter reports said it was a mistake and a temporary design. That would be changed out quickly. They were terribly wrong for sure. Alexander came up with the idea for the Thunderbolt. Kartveli, an engineer born in Georgia who came to the United States in 1927 and joined Republic Aviation Company, which took over from Severke Aircraft. His European approaches to design philosophy were very different. We're from Europe. Designers were obsessed with reducing weight, and made every part as simple as possible. The cart was pretty much built to survive. More than anything else, the airframe of the P-47 was made with never-before-seen structural strength. There was only one piece of main wing spar, forged aluminum that is 4 inches thick in the middle and only 2 inches thick at the wings. Advice: this spar could stand up to 12 G loads without breaking. 3 times thick, strong enough to destroy a Messerschmitt Bf-109. The fuselage was built around the Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp radial engine is very big. But more. The most important thing was that the whole plane was surrounded by revolutionary defenses. The turbocharger system, oil coolers, intercoolers, and, most importantly, the pilot were all between the engine and the pilot. Multiple fuel tanks, each with a different amount of space inside. P-47B and C models carried 305 G on the inside. The P-47D-25 bubble canopy, 370 G were carried by the most common D-40 variants in battle. P-47N from late in the war. Versions for service in the Pacific carried an amazing 556 gal. Each gallon was stored in tanks that closed themselves, a technology that would be very important. Some fuel tanks have been around for a while now. They were made by the British. The Americans made them better. But the P-47 was used in a way that had never been done before. And how well it works. There were several layers of rubber around each fuel cell, a substance that would swell and seal when it came in contact with gasoline, quickly filling in bullet holes. The German pilots. This was learned the hard way. An attack that would have killed another fighter in flames only made holes in that. They sealed themselves. The P-47 stuck in the air. The pilot was safe from a lot more than tanks for fuel. People on the ground in the United States called the pilot's seat a armored bathtub. Term understated how well it worked. Though was protected by thick armor plating. Pilot from almost every angle. The back of the seat was made of face-hardened steel. Close-range 20mm cannon rounds can't go through this armor. The backrest had extra armor plating on it. Another armor plate under the seat was there to protect them from ground fire during attacks from low altitude. In front, a thick windshield made of bulletproof glass could stop even shells for 30mm cannons. German pilots who were used to flying planes where armor was minimal to save weight, they faced an opponent who could take hits that would kill them right away. Major Heinz Bär was the third most successful German ace, with 220 wins overall. Fronts would later talk about how frustrated he was in interviews after the war. The P-47 had to be handled very carefully because it could take a huge amount of lead. We could hit them over and over with our cannon. The rounds we fired hit the pilot, but he never fell. The Thunderbolt pilot could take a seat. He was there taking in our fire and waiting for his chance to return fire. It was warfare on the mind. These people were hit, but they wouldn't die. That June afternoon in 1943 was the first big air battle that showed how tough the P-47 really was. The Jägerschwadron 26 had jumped Robert Johnson's squadron. It was led by some of Germany's best pilots. The strategies that had worked very well against P-38 Lightnings and P-40 Warhawks did not work at all against the Thunderbolt. Johnson's fighter was badly damaged. At first, it fell and spun toward Earth. Through a lot of physical work, fighting controls that didn't work very well, and being half-blind from hydraulic fluid burns, Johnson was able to get the wings level and get out of the dive. He turned northwest while taking care of his broken-down plane. He was going as slowly as possible toward England, but he couldn't see well because his canopy was broken and his eyes were burning. Then one FW-190, which showed up behind him. The German pilot, who was probably Ostleutnant Egon Meyer of JG-2, then one of the Luftwaffe's most successful bomber destroyers, with more than 100 victories, closed in on the slow walker. Meyer had already used up all of his 20mm ammunition killing B-7S earlier in the duty, but his 7.92mm machine guns were still working. He said over and over, pass after pass, hitting Johnson's Thunderbolt with accurate fire each time. John Q. He had no choice but to slow his plane down to just above stall speed and slew it left and right, which made man more dangerous. Aim 4. He even fired back without looking when Meyer passed, but his poor eyesight and broken controls made it impossible to aim accurately. Meyer made pass after pass. Every time a bullet hit Johnson's fighter, the P-47 kept flying. Mayer must have run out of bullets after the third attack. In full, per Johnson's story, which was confirmed by his wingman, who caught up moments later, Mayer pulled up next to the damaged Thunderbolt, just far enough away for Johnson to see him clearly. The Nazis. The pilot looked at the badly damaged American fighter that was still in the air and waved his wings as a salute. The pilot then turned around, going back to France. Johnson kept going alone toward England. He got to RAF Manston in Kent, but his oily eyes and nose made it hard for him to see the runway. A windshield. Thankfully, his landing gear still worked. He landed and stopped rolling. Ground crews thought about how much damage had been done in silence. 21 direct 20mm guns. Hits. More than 27.9 2mm machine gun hits. The whole tail. A piece was torn up. The canopy was broken. Control cables were cut. Hydraulic systems were taken apart. The plane was deemed too damaged to be fixed economically, and it was then used to make spare parts. But Johnson was able to walk away with only minor injuries. After 5 days, he would go back to fighting. By the end of his tour in May 1944, he had won 27 battles in the air, becoming one of the best fighter pilots in U.S. history and the first U.S. pilot in Europe to beat Eddie Rickenbacker's World War I record. 26 kills is a record. Johnson's survival was important for many reasons. One pilot's good luck. Major David is in charge of operations for the 56th Fighter Group. Schilling saw right away that the P-47's ability to survive had changed. Basic rules for fighting. In reports that were written all summer 1943, now kept in the archives of the Air Force Historical Research Agency, 56th Fighter. A tactical revolution was written down by group commanders. American pilots could take punishments that would kill, fight with anyone else. This made it possible to use aggressive tactics that would have been dangerous in smaller planes. P-47 pilots. They were able to go after attacks for longer, press home deflection shots that required flying through enemy fire, and most importantly, keep bombers safe by staying in the fight and not leaving to avoid damage. The Thunderbolt did more than just thrive. It gave American pilots new ways to fight. German commanders of fighters quickly. They saw that they had a big problem. Their whole strategy for fighting was based on energy fighting, which, using speed and height to your advantage to make slashing attacks, and then getting away before the enemy could react. In P-47, this doctrine didn't work. The Thunderbolt could take the first hit, then chase after it, and in any long-range attack. In battle, the P-47's advantages were too great to ignore. The 8 Browning M250s it has caliber machine guns, which were not as powerful as German 20mm or 30mm guns. 1,200 rounds per minute were fired from all of the cannons together. Read more. The American machine guns were also very reliable. They rarely jammed, even during long battles. English cannons often didn't work, leaving pilots defenseless when they needed to be. By the summer of 1943, this was starting to show up in German tactical instructions. Documents that were found after the war showed that the Luftwaffe was becoming more worried. Fighter wings were sent out. There are instructions that stress getting kills on the first attack pass. Pilots were told very clearly not to think that visible strikes meant the plane was destroyed, not to think that if there was fire or smoke, they knew they were going to die soon. So they didn't stay in battle with damaged Thunderbolts that were. Often, they are still fully able to fight. These instructions were an important admission. It's the Luftwaffes, the best pilots, who were flying planes they thought were better, were told to stay out of long-term combat with American forces. Fighters. It had a huge effect on German morale. The summer and fall of the strategic bombing campaign reached its peak in 1943. American B-17 and B-24 bombers went deep into Germany and hit planes, factories, oil refineries, and plants that make ball bearings. Now the P-47 groups. They escorted the bombers with several full fighter groups and plans for many more. German soldier. Under a lot of pressure to stop the bombers, the wings did everything they could to attack. The results were terrible, not in terms of how many planes they destroyed, but in terms of how happy their pilots were and how well they could do their job in battle. When bomber formations were being attacked, fighters from both bombers and escorts fired at the planes. The guns on the B-7 could hurt fighters, but rarely killed them with a single hit. The guns on the P-47 wiped out everything they hit. But what was even worse was seeing American fighters keep flying even though they should have been grounded because of damage. Killing. Major G.A. Rall, who has 275 points, is the fourth highest scoring ace in history. He had many victories and flew most of his missions on the Eastern Front, where he did very well. He took off one in August 1943 to fight American bombers in the West. He didn't fly against them again. In interviews after the war, he said, "On the Eastern Front, if you hit a Russian, you die." Strong as a fighter, it went down. The LGG-3, the Yak-1, and even later models. Compared to Western fighters, they were weak. In the West, I attacked a Thunderbolt from the perfect spot. Close. I had time. I fired everything. I saw things fly off and hits on the. The American never changed his mind about the fuselage, the wings, or the tail. He turned on me and almost shot me down. I told my commander I would rather stay in the East because the math was better there. Luftwaffe pilots felt this way more and more often. The Eastern Front, despite having more troops, it was less scary and more pleasant to think about. Russian fighters could be destroyed. American Thunderbolts seemed. Statistics supported the idea that the P-47 was impossible to destroy. In 1943, in battle, 0.7% of each type were lost, compared to 1.2% for Spitfires and 1.4% for the other types. To P-38 Lightnings. What's more, of the P-47s that came back from battle damaged, over 90% were fixed and back in service within a week. The planes could be shot full of holes and fly on. The next day, it could be fixed up and fly again. As German intelligence got more information, the engineering philosophy behind this ability to stay alive became more clear. P-47s that had been captured were sent to the Rechlin testing facility in Germany, where Lufthansa engineers did thorough tests on them. Examinations. Their reports, which were found in German archives after the war, showed both admiration and anger. German engineers saw that the P-47 used materials and building methods that put durability over lightweight. For example, German fighters use thin. The P-47 is made of aluminum stampings that are riveted together with as few fasteners as possible. Thicker gauge aluminum and stronger fasteners were used in German designs. Used single-load paths to save time and money, and the P-47 had structures that could be used twice. If one spar was broken, another could hold the weight. If one control cable was. If one of the cables got cut, there were backups. The plane was built with the assumption that it would get damaged in battle, but they had to get the pilot home anyway. In a late 1943 German technical report, the philosophical difference was summed up. By our standards, the American design is not very good. They use a lot of. They are willing to take on heavy penalties for using more material than is needed for basic structural integrity. They have redundant systems that give up maneuverability for safety. When it comes to operations, their philosophy is incredibly useful. Our pilots and our lighter, more maneuverable fighters die, but they live to fly again. More people than us. The Americans have solved a different issue than we have. They made fighters to win wars, while we made fighters to win dogfights. A very important point was made when it was said that German engineering had produced aircraft of extraordinary performance. The Bf-109 was faster than the P-47 below 25,000 feet most of the time. The FW-190 could turn it around. The Me-262 jet was coming in. In 1944, service was faster than anything the Allies had, but performance was not good. It didn't matter how well the P-47 was made if the pilot didn't live to use it. It was clear that fighter combat was all about the pilot's survival. An experienced pilot in a less maneuverable, but a more survivable plane would beat a beginner in a high-performance plane. And most importantly, the more survivable plane would win. This would make pilots with more experience because they would have lived longer to gain that experience. There was a new phase in the air war in the fall of 1943. Long-range escort missions began. Further into Germany, the P-47, which had external drop tanks that could be thrown away when empty, and now had a long enough range to follow bombers to targets that they couldn't reach before. Protection for fighters. German fighter commanders were in a tough spot. Pilots reported that killing Thunderbolts required a lot more ammunition than is usually needed in battle. A lot of pilots fired all of their ammunition at one P-47, but it didn't come down. This meant that even if they made it through the battle, they had to go back to base without any ammunition, so they couldn't fight bombers or other enemies. Fighters. Whole German fighter wings were being rendered useless in battle, not by being shot down, but by having to waste bullets on things that couldn't kill them. The Americans escort General Major Adolf Galland, who is in charge of all the German fighters. From November 1941 to January 1945, the military sent out orders that tried to deal with this issue. In October 1943, he told pilots not to pay attention to American bombers instead of fighters because bombers were thought to be the real threat and fighters were just a distraction. The campaign would end if the bombers were destroyed and the escorts were killed. American fighter pilots, who didn't have to worry about defense because their planes, to stay alive, they became even more hostile. They would dive on German formations and fly through initial first fire defenses and then kill all of the German fighters that tried to attack bombers. While flying with the 56th Fighter Group, First Lieutenant Francis Gabreski became the face of this hostile. Gabreski, the son of Polish immigrants, had personal goals besides serving in the military. Under Nazi rule, he still lived in Poland and flew every mission as if he were still there. He was getting revenge on someone, and his plan made perfect use of the P-47 strengths. He would find German fighters attacking bombers, dive on them from above, and hold off their fire if he had to. Between August 1943 and April 1944, they tried to turn on him. He then killed them all with a hail of machine gun fire from close range. Gabreski shot down 28 German planes in July 1944, making him the best American ace in Europe. He lived through hundreds of combat missions, many of which damaged his plane badly. History. The winter of 1943 to 1944 brought the air battles in Europe were at their fiercest during this time, and Germany's aircraft industry was constantly under attack. Even though the Luftwaffe was working hard to make more fighters, experienced pilots were leaving the army. The P-47 was killing German pilots faster than new ones could be trained. At the same time, groups were getting stronger. In the U.S., new pilot training was starting. Stressed that the P-47's ability to survive was a key teaching point. Clearly told the students, your plane can take damage that would destroy anything else. Take advantage of that. Hold down your threats. You will make it home with the Thunderbolt. Major Hubert Zena, who was in charge of the 56th Fighter Group, turned this aggressive way of thinking into official tactics. The formation that became known as the ZMAN was made to make the P-47's strengths. Instead of the usual close formations that made it hard to move, Zema's fighters flew in. There were loose, adaptable groups that could act quickly when there were threats. The P-47S would not attack when German fighters did back off in a defensive way. Instead, they would attack, forcing head-on fire where the P-47's armor would protect it. And firepower gave it a huge advantage. German pilots are used to when enemies tried to hide. They were met by Americans who flew directly into their fire, taking it in, and then sent back a devastating fire of their own. It was February 1944 when the situation had changed a lot. The P-51 Mustang had an even longer range, beginning to add to P-47 groups. However, the Thunderbolt stayed the workhorse of bomber takeoff. Because it was tough, it could be used for the most dangerous missions. The first penetration of German airspace, fighting over targets with strong defenses and stopping German air bases. You could move the P-51S around more easily and faster, making them better for dog in a fight. But when the mission called for an aircraft that could take damage and keep fighting, commanders picked the P-47. Operation Argument began in the spring of 1944. The goal of the Big Week campaign was to stop Germany from making fighter planes. From February 20th to February 25th, it was the most intense air campaign that had ever been seen by American and British forces. The 8th Air Force in England and the 15th Air Force in Italy flew approximately 3,800 heavy bomber. The RAF added over 2,800 night sorties and over 2,800 day sorties. Pretty much, German airplane factories were hit by 10,000 tons of bombs. The P-47 groups had most of the daylight fighter escort work. More than 500 German soldiers were destroyed during the six-day battle. The loss rate for P-47 stayed below 1% per. When German pilots had to defend their factories and airfields, they didn't have no choice but to take part. An unimaginable number of them died. The next step. Reports from German units that were sent after Big showed that morale was falling. Pilots said that they hit Thunderbolts over and over, but they kept fighting. Some German pilots moved off, asking to be moved to other fronts. Others had mechanical issues that kept them on the ground. It's the Luftwaffes. The personnel office looked into it and found that many people didn't want to fly against American forces, in particular, citing run-ins with P-47s. The P-47 came out in the summer of 1944. A new job, attack from the ground. Thunderbolt's ability to take damage. It was perfect for attacks on German positions from low places. Unlike other fighters who can be ground fire, the P-47 could fly through heavy enemy fire and deliver its payload and come back home with damage from battle that would have destroyed lighter planes. In the months of June and July 1944, thousands of ground attack missions were flown by P-47 groups to help the Allies move forward from Normandy. Ground in Germany. For some reason, the sound of the P-47's radial engine made the enemy afraid. People called it Jabbo, which is short for Jag bomber or fighter bomber. The word was used to scare people more than to describe the plane. Robert Harmon, a tenant on the left who was flying with the 362nd Fighter Group, was on July 25th when several 37mm guns were used to attack German positions near St. Lo. His plane was hit by anti-aircraft shells. One shell hit his right wing tip and broke it off, taking off several feet of building. Another one got into his engine and destroyed 2 cylinders. For a short time, the engine caught fire. A third hit him in the tail, cutting the elevator control cables. Harmon was able to put out the fire by following the steps for turning off and starting the engine. Using trim tabs, he got some control back. Alone, making up for the broken cables, he flew his broken-down plane 150 miles back to his base in England on an engine that only had 16 of its 18 cylinders working. The plane was thought to be beyond repair, so spare parts were taken from it. Harmon was not hurt, though. He was going to fly 89 more battles to go before the war ends. Ground crews developed dark humor about the damage. They joked that the P-47 only needed 3 things to fly: an engine, running on at least half its cylinders, at least one aileron working, and a pilot with the guts to fly it. The jokes reflected a deeper truth. The aircraft's toughness had become so expected that anything less than catastrophic damage was considered routine. German anti-aircraft crews equipped with 20mm, 37mm, and 88mm guns discovered that bringing down a P-47 required far more hits than any other Allied aircraft. Standard doctrine assumed 2 or 3 20mm hits would destroy a fighter. Against the P-47, crews reported needing 10 or more direct hits, and even then, the aircraft often made it back to Allied territory. The P-47's radial engine was particularly difficult to stop. Unlike inline engines where a single cooling system hit caused rapid failure, the radial could lose entire cylinders and continue running. American pilots reported flying home on engines missing 3 or 4 cylinders, still producing enough power to maintain altitude. In the Pacific Theater, the P-47 served with distinction from 1943 through war's end. The long-range P-47N variant, with its 556 gallons internal fuel capacity and wet-wing design allowing 1,266 gall total with external tanks, was specifically developed for Pacific operations. These aircraft escorted B-29 Super Fortress bombers on raids against Japan and provided ground support throughout the island-hopping campaign. The P-47's ruggedness proved equally valuable against Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft fire. The 318th Fighter Group, operating P-47s from Mishima near Okinawa, flew some of the longest fighter escort missions in history, over 1,500 m to targets in Japan and back. The aircraft's ability to absorb battle damage and continue flying was as crucial in the Pacific as it had been in Europe. The final major air battle of the European theater occurred on January 1, 1945. Operation Bodenplatte, a desperate German attempt to destroy Allied air power on the ground. The Luftwaffe launched over 850 fighters in coordinated strikes against Allied airfields in Belgium and Holland. The operation achieved some initial success, destroying 305 Allied aircraft on the ground and damaging another 190, but as Allied fighters scrambled and engaged, the results were catastrophic for the Germans. The battle lasted most of the day, sprawling across hundreds of square miles. By evening, the Luftwaffe had lost 271 aircraft destroyed, with 143 pilots killed or missing, including 3 Ghana Commodora, 5 Gruppen Kommandura, and 14 Staffelkapitän. The loss of experienced leadership was irreplaceable. P-47 groups engaged throughout the day lost aircraft primarily to ground fire. During initial German strafing attacks, not one P-47 was lost in air-to-air combat despite being outnumbered in many engagements. German pilots returning from Bodenplatte reported the same frustrating experience they had suffered throughout the war. They would hit P-47s repeatedly, see visible damage, yet watch the American fighters continue fighting. Major Gerhard Barkhorn, second highest scoring ace in history with 301 victories, all on the Eastern Front, participated in Bodenplatte. In post-war interviews, he described shooting at one P-47 with his entire ammunition load, seeing numerous strikes. Yet the aircraft continued flying until he finally hit a critical component. He noted that with the same ammunition on the Eastern Front, he could have shot down 5 Russian fighters. The war ended in May 1945. The final accounting showed the P-47's extraordinary success. Over 15,683 P-47s were built during the war, more than any other American fighter except the P-51 Mustang. P-47s flew 546,000 combat sorties in the European and Mediterranean theaters. They were credited with destroying 3,752 enemy aircraft in air-to-air combat, plus approximately 3,000 more on the ground for a combined total of about 7,000 enemy aircraft destroyed. They also destroyed 9,000 locomotives, 86,000 railroad cars, and 6,000 armored vehicles in ground attack missions. But most importantly, the P-47's loss rate per sortie was the lowest of any American fighter, 0.7% in the European theater. For every 1,000 sorties flown, only 7 P-47s were lost. By comparison, the P-38 Lightning lost 13 per 000. The P-51 Mustang lost 9 per 1,000. The P-47's survivability translated directly into pilot survival. Of American aviators who served in Europe, those flying P-47s had the highest survival rate of any fighter pilots. This wasn't just a statistical anomaly. It represented thousands of young men who came home to their families instead of dying over Germany. The engineering decisions that made the P-47 tough were also humanitarian decisions, though the engineers probably never framed them that way. German aces interviewed after the war uniformly expressed respect bordering on awe for the Thunderbolt's toughness. When aviation historians asked General Lieutenant Adolf Galland in post-war interviews what Allied aircraft he most respected, his answer was immediate and consistent: the P-47 Thunderbolt, not because it was the best fighter aerodynamically. The P-51 was faster and more maneuverable. The Spitfire was more elegant, but the Thunderbolt was nearly unkillable. You could hit it and hit it and hit it, and it would keep coming. That was psychological defeat, knowing that your best shots might not be enough. Obus Johannes Steinhoff, 176. Victory ace who survived the war despite being shot down multiple times, provided perhaps the most eloquent summary in his 1970 memoir. We learned to respect all our opponents. The Russian pilots for their courage, the British for their determination, the Americans for their numbers, but we feared the P-47 specifically. It represented American industrial might in tangible form. It was the equivalent of a flying fortress, a machine so overbuilt, so excessive in its protection that it defied our conception of what a fighter should be. We flew graceful, efficient, deadly machines. They flew armored fortresses, and in that and their fortresses defeated our thoroughbred ads. The technical data supported these subjective impressions. Post-war analysis by the United States Strategic Bombing Survey examined thousands of combat reports, damage assessments, and aircraft recovery records. Their findings quantified what German pilots had experienced firsthand. While specific hit-to-kill ratios varied by ammunition type and impact location, the P-47 consistently required far more hits to bring down than other Allied fighters. German pilots expended more ammunition per P-47 destroyed than for any other Allied fighter type. This explains German frustration perfectly. Their aircraft carried limited ammunition, typically 200 rounds per 20mm cannon, and 1,000 rounds per machine gun. A single combat sortie might encounter multiple American fighters, expending most or all ammunition on one P-47 left them defenseless against others. The engineering analysis revealed the specific features that created this toughness. The R-280 engine's radial configuration meant that, even with multiple cylinders destroyed, the remaining cylinders could distribute the load and maintain power. The massive propeller, weighing over 400 pounds, had enough rotational inertia to keep spinning even if the engine lost significant power, providing enough thrust to maintain flight. The structural redundancy meant that primary load paths could fail without causing catastrophic structural collapse. The self-sealing fuel tanks could handle multiple punctures without leaking or catching fire. The armor protection covered not just vital areas, but also redundant systems, ensuring that even if primary controls were damaged, backup systems would function. The P-47's influence on post-war fighter design was profound and lasting. The United States Air Force, analyzing combat data from World War II and the Korean War, concluded that survivability was as important as performance in fighter design. This philosophy influenced every American fighter developed subsequently. The F-86 Sabre, F-100 Super Sabre, F-4 Phantom, all incorporated lessons from the P-47. Redundant systems protected vital components, survivability as a design priority equal to performance. Even the Soviet Union, capturing German analysis of the P-47 and conducting their own studies, reached similar conclusions. Post-war Soviet fighters emphasized protection far more than pre-war designs had. The global evolution of fighter design shifted toward the American model, away from the German model of performance over protection. Modern fighter pilots flying aircraft costing hundreds of millions of dollars still study the P-47's combat record. The lessons remain relevant. A pilot who survives to complete the mission is more valuable than a pilot who achieves maximum performance but doesn't return. Modern aircraft like the A-10 Thunderbolt, II, named explicitly in honor of the P-47, carry forward the same philosophy. Built an aircraft that can absorb enormous damage and still accomplish its mission. The A-10's titanium bathtub protecting the pilot, its redundant control systems, its ability to fly with entire sections of the aircraft destroyed, all traced directly back to Alexander Kartveli's design philosophy in creating the original Thunderbolt. The human cost of the air war makes the P-47's survivability even more meaningful. Of the 130,000 American airmen who served in Europe during World War II, approximately 26,000 died in combat. The death rate varied dramatically by aircraft type and mission. P-47 pilots had approximately a 12% combat fatality rate over a full tour. P-38 pilots suffered approximately 18% fatalities. B-17 and B-24 bomber crews endured approximately 20% losses. The P-47's protection translated directly into thousands of young men who saw their children grow up, thousands of sons who returned to their mothers, thousands of husbands who grew old with their wives. The engineering decisions that made the P-47 tough were decisions that saved lives. The German pilots who survived the war carried their respect for the P-47 throughout their lives. When the German Air Force was reformed in the 1950s as part of NATO, many former Luftwaffe pilots returned to service. They found themselves flying alongside American pilots, many of whom had flown P-47s against them a decade earlier. The former enemies discovered mutual respect. German pilots would ask about the P-47's toughness, seeking to understand how it had been achieved. American pilots would ask about German tactics. These conversations, preserved in Veteran Association newsletters and reunion documents, reveal consistent themes. The Germans admired the engineering. The Americans admired the skill. Both groups acknowledged that the P-47 survivability had been decisive, not because it won dogfights through performance, but because it won the campaign through attrition, keeping American pilots alive long enough to gain experience, long enough to become dangerous, long enough to win. In 1961, Republic Aviation Company held a reunion for former P-47 pilots. Over 2,000 attended, representing nearly every fighter group that had flown the aircraft in combat. The keynote speaker was Colonel Hubert Zena, who had commanded the 56th Fighter Group, the top-scoring P-47 unit with 674.5 air-to-air victories and 311 ground kills. His speech captured the essence of what the aircraft had meant to those who flew it. We didn't fly the fastest fighter. We didn't fly the most maneuverable fighter. We didn't fly the prettiest fighter. We flew the fighter that brought us home. When you're 23 years old, 6 miles above Germany with the Luftwaffe shooting at you, that's all that matters. The Thunderbolt was built by people who understood that it was built by people who cared whether we lived or died. Every one of us in this room owes our life to the men and women who designed and built that aircraft. They gave us protection when we needed it most. They gave us a fighting chance when the odds were against us. They gave us the confidence to press the attack because we knew no matter what happened, the Jug would get us home. The nickname, Jug, short for Juggernaut, captured the aircraft's essence perfectly. It was unstoppable, relentless, inevitable. German pilots learned to fear that inevitability. They could hit it, damage it, make it smoke, and stream fuel, but they couldn't stop it. And knowing they couldn't stop it demoralized them in ways that pure performance never could have. The psychological dimension of the P-47's toughness was as important as the physical dimension. German pilots lost confidence. They stopped pressing threats. They disengaged early. They avoided combat when possible. The entire tactical posture of the Luftwaffe changed in response to an aircraft that simply remained airborne no matter what they threw at it. The final assessment belongs to Oberstleutnant Heinz Bär, the third highest scoring German ace, who provided this evaluation in a 1957 interview with an American aviation magazine. When asked what he thought had been the most important Allied weapon of the war, his answer surprised the interviewer. Not the atomic bomb, not the B-17, not even the P-51 with its long range. The P-47 Thunderbolt because it kept their pilots alive. Everything else follows from that. If you lose your pilots, you lose your Air Force. If you lose your Air Force, you lose the war. The Americans understood this fundamental truth. We didn't. Not until too late. We built beautiful, fast, deadly fighters optimized for performance. They built a flying fortress optimized for survival. Their flying fortress defeated our fighters because wars are won by survivors, not by dead heroes, no matter how skilled or brave. The P-47 created survivors. It created the men who defeated us. This admission from one of Germany's greatest aces represents the ultimate validation of the P-47's design philosophy. The German aces were not wrong about their aircraft's performance. The Bf-109 was faster at low to medium altitudes. The FW-190 could outturn the Thunderbolt in many situations. The Me-262 jet was revolutionary, but none of that mattered, because the German pilots didn't survive long enough to fully exploit their advantages. The P-47 pilots survived. They survived first missions where they made mistakes. They survived the learning curve that made them dangerous. They survived long enough to become the aces who dominated the skies over Germany in 1944 and 1945. The Thunderbolt didn't just protect pilots. It created the generation of aviators who won the air war. Today, only a handful of airworthy P-47s remain, carefully maintained by museums and collectors. When they appear at air shows, aging veterans sometimes attend. Men now in their 90s who flew the aircraft 80 years ago. They stand beside The massive fighters running their hands over the aluminum skin, remembering missions, remembering friends who didn't come home, remembering the aircraft that saved their lives. German veterans occasionally attend these same shows, men who once tried to shoot down these aircraft, now united with their former enemies in old age. The conversations between them are remarkable. The Americans thank the Germans for their courage and skill. The Germans thank the Americans for treating prisoners with dignity, and both groups acknowledge the aircraft that stands between them. The flying fortress that proved tough enough to absorb everything the Luftwaffe could throw at it and still brought its pilots home. The legacy lives on in every fighter aircraft that prioritizes pilot survival, in every design that chooses protection over pure performance. The P-47 proved that the best fighter is not the one that wins dogfights through superior performance, but the one that wins wars by keeping pilots alive. The German aces learned this lesson the hard way, pouring cannon fire into American fighters that wouldn't fall, watching their tactical advantages dissolve against an enemy that would not be stopped. In the end, that was the Thunderbolt's greatest weapon. Not its 8 machine guns, not its speed, not its structural strength, but its absolute refusal to quit. It was a fighter that matched the spirit of the nation that built it, a machine that embodied the determination that won the war. The German aces shot it full of holes, and it kept flying. That simple fact decided the outcome of the air war over Europe. The P-47 Thunderbolt was not the fastest fighter, not the most maneuverable, not the longest ranged, but it was the toughest. And in the brutal mathematics of aerial combat, toughness was the quality that mattered most. The Nazis' aces admitted as much, even as it cost them the war. Their admission stands as the ultimate testament to American engineering, to Alexander Kartveli's vision, and to the flying fortress that refused to